Hi, my name is Gary Goff, a professional landscape photographer. Coming up in this video, I'm offering you guys the perfect hack when it comes to camera settings for long exposure. If you find that you guess your settings or that you need to use an app, then as long as you can remember one number, I guarantee I will take away all of the guesswork and you'll never need to pick up an app again. And to help you guys along with the process, I'm going to record everything from my POV, my point of view. In other words, I'm going to record the back of my camera, so when I explain things to you guys, you can see exactly how that translates to camera settings. So first things first, camera on a tripod, and let's get our composition all set up. At the moment, I'm photographing an old pier at Lytham St Anne's, and presently the tide is out, so around the feet there's nothing but sand, but it's an incoming tide, so 30 minutes time from now the water will be up and around the feet. But between now and then I'm just going to set my camera up, talking the process through to you guys of course, and then I'm going to wait for the tide to come up. What's important to note as well is photography is a science, which means this hack will work on whatever camera, make, model or brand you currently use, and it'll also work with any filter system. Now for this I'm going to be using a Nissi V7 filter system, but I promise you this will work with any filter system. And this is something that's optional, but I tend to use a soft grad filter just to balance the brighter light that you always find in the sky with a floor. If you're going to do that, then apply that first before we start talking about settings. Okay, so everything is in place. Here's the hack. First thing to point out, if you use a 3 or a 6 top filter, then this hack won't apply. If you use a 3 or a 6 top filter, then the best way to deal with that is simply apply your 3 or 6 top filter now, and then just adjust your camera settings according to the light meter or preferably your histogram. So this hack is all to do with long exposures using a 10 stop or a 15 stop filter. Let's talk about a 10 stop filter first of all. So the first thing we need to do is to set our camera's mode to manual. It's important, if you want to follow my instructions, that your camera is set to manual. Now, there is a magic number, and this is what I call the hack. And all you have to do, bear in mind at the moment we're only talking about using a 10 stop filter. You just need to remember one number, and that number is 30. Just remember the number 30. The first thing we need to do is to set our camera's shutter speed to a 30th of a second. And I'm going to do that like so. Now what's important to make this hack work is that we do not touch our shutter speed. Our shutter speed has to be left at 30th of a second. If there's too much light hitting the sensor, which clearly it is, then we need to reduce the light down that's hitting our sensor, and we do that with a combination of two things, our ISO and our aperture. First thing I'm going to do is reduce our ISO right down. The lower the number, the lower the sensitivity of your sensor. It works in a slightly different way with modern day cameras, but the principle still applies in exactly the same way. So we've now desensitized our sensor down to ISO 100. Clearly there's still too much light hitting our sensor. So what we now need to do is to raise the number of the aperture. If you raise the number of the aperture, it makes the aperture hole smaller. Your aperture is just a hole that lets light through, nothing any more than that. But the oddball part of your aperture is the bigger the number, the smaller the hole. So if you want to reduce light hitting our sensor, then we just need to increase the number of our aperture. And you can see me doing that now as I start to increase it. If you look at the histogram, you'll see the histogram moving towards the left hand side. And we're gonna leave it at something like that. As long as the histogram isn't touching the right hand side, if it is, then that means there is overexposure in the frame. And if you're not quite sure how your histogram works, if you open your aperture, letting more light in, your histogram will move to the right. If you make your hole smaller by raising the number of your aperture, your picture will get darker, and in which case your histogram will move to the left. So what I'm going to do in this instance is leave it there, and that is perfect. So that's stage one. Now on to stage two. This is going to blow your mind just how easy this is. We are now going to place our 10-stop filter onto the front element of our lens, like so. Now, because it's a 10-stop filter, 30th of a second will translate to 30 seconds. So now that we've applied our 10-stop filter, we're just simply going to slow our shutter speed all the way down 10 stops until it reads 30 seconds. All the way down until it reads 30 seconds. And that is how easy it is to set your camera up to shoot long exposures. Photography is a science. Just take time to learn the science, and there's no need for guesswork, and there's no need to ever look at an app again. It's that simple. Now, if I depress my fire button, we're now going to take a 30-second exposure, and we'll do that, and then I'll talk you through the next process, which is to lengthen that shutter speed to maybe a minute or even 2 minutes and possibly longer. So this is the picture I've just captured. Remember, at the moment you're not going to see anything amazing because the tide is out, and on a 30-second exposure we're not going to see much movement in the sky either, especially because today it's a very wishy-washy sky. Now let's talk about how we lengthen the shutter speed. At the moment it's 30 seconds, but what happens if we want to extend it to a minute or 2 minutes? So the first thing we need to do is understand this thing called stops of light. It's not too technical. Stops of light are really easy to understand. Stops of light just simply means double or half of any one of the three elements. So if your shutter speed was 125th of a second, if you doubled the shutter speed to 250th of a second, that would actually reduce the light hitting the sensor by 1 stop, because 250 is exactly double 125. When it comes to your aperture, the F numbers can be a bit odd, but I'll put the main F numbers up on the screen now so you could see the main numbers. But again, the beauty of cameras nowadays is they are all set up in increments of thirds. That means whether you're adjusting your ISO, your aperture, or your shutter speed, because your camera is set up in increments of thirds, then it's just 3 clicks. Try it. Grab your camera, look at the shutter speed, set it to something like 100th of a second, and then take it 3 clicks to the right, and it'll be exactly double 100, which is 200. Take it 3 clicks back to the left, and it'll go back to where you were. 3 clicks again, it'll exactly half it. Every time you apply 3 clicks, it'll always double or half depending on which way you go. Well, that works in exactly the same way with your aperture and your ISO as well. If your ISO is 100, 3 clicks will take you to 200, 3 clicks will take it to 400. There might be some anomalies with certain cameras, but basically it's double or half. And your aperture, it might be difficult to try and figure out what double or half of f8 or f11 is, but grab your aperture dial and click it 3 ways. If the number goes up, you've now halved the size of the hole, which means you've now reduced the light falling onto your sensor by 1 stop. If you make your number smaller, you'll make the hole twice as big, and therefore you will add 1 stop of light onto your sensor if it's the same 3 clicks. So moving forward, just remember one thing: 3 clicks equals 1 stop of light. So with that in mind, now let's look at our settings. We are currently at f11, ISO 100 and 30 seconds. Now, if we want to extend that shutter speed by 1 stop, that will take it from 30 seconds to 60 seconds. That'll take it from 30 seconds to 60 seconds. Half a minute to a minute. But of course, if we do that, we'll end up lengthening the time the shutter speed has stayed open by 1 stop. So that's allowing 1 stop of extra light to fall onto our sensor. Well, to compensate, what we now need to do is to lose that 1 stop of light, and we do that by either closing our aperture by 1 stop, which is 3 clicks, or if possible, lowering the ISO the same 3 clicks, or half the number. Now looking at our settings, if I want to extend my shutter speed to 60 seconds, which is 1 minute, I now need to reduce the light hitting my sensor by 1 stop. Well, I can do that quite easily in this instance with my aperture. My aperture is at f11. I can quite easily reduce the light hitting my sensor by closing that aperture up. 3 clicks, which will take it from f11 to f16. Watch. Aperture. 1, 2, 3. And as I adjust the 3 clicks, you can even see the light reducing on to the camera's sensor itself, and you can see the histogram moving to the left. Let me do that again. We were at f11. Look at the light on the image now, and also look at the histogram. And I'm now going to reduce the light by 1 stop. 1, 2, 3. And each time I do it, the light falling onto the sensor reduces by 1/3 of a stop. And now I've done it 3 times, it's now 1 stop. So now you can see the light in the picture is actually 1 stop of light too dark. So to compensate, we're now going to lengthen the shutter speed. We're now going to lengthen the shutter speed by the same 1 stop, which is 60 seconds. There you go. So once we've got our base figure of 30th, which equals 30 seconds, we can now play around with our ISO and our aperture to reduce light falling onto the sensor and therefore lengthening the shutter speed. And I'm now going to take the same image at 1 minute, and away she goes. So what you're looking at now is a picture I've just captured at a 1 minute exposure. So now let's talk about extending that shutter speed by another stop. Let's go for a 2 minute exposure. So first of all, I have to look at my ISO and my aperture and try and determine if I can reduce the light hitting my sensor by 1 stop. Well, I can do it either way with my particular camera. I can actually, 3 clicks, reduce my ISO down to an ISO of 50, which is half of ISO 100. Again, you'll notice that the image has got darker by 1 stop, which means now I need to add that stop of light back in, which is where the double the length of time the shutter speed stays open comes in. So now I'm just simply going to take the same shot, but this time instead of a 60-second exposure, it's a 120-second exposure. 1, 2, and away she goes. Now the picture you're looking at is a 2 minute exposure. Now at this present moment in time, you're not going to see much of a difference between a 30-second exposure and a 2 minute exposure, simply because there's no water around the base of the old pier, and the clouds are very wishy-washy. But don't worry about that. At the moment, I'm just talking you through the process. I will retake these pictures when the tide has come up and around the old pier, and then hopefully it'll start to make sense if it doesn't already. But I mentioned a second ago, extending your shutter speed from 30 seconds to 60 seconds. Now there's one thing to bear in mind. A lot of cameras will only allow you to extend your shutter speed to 30 seconds, but don't worry about that. You just apply the same technique that you've just learned, but when you need to extend your shutter speed beyond 30 seconds, you need to set your camera to bulb mode. If you don't know what bulb mode is the only setting within your camera that doesn't have a predetermined length of time that the shutter speed stays open. The shutter speed will stay open for as long as you depress the fire button. Now, I wouldn't recommend standing here with your finger on the fire button for 60 seconds or 2 minutes or even longer. So what you would then need to do is to buy a remote trigger. But don't worry about that, they only cost about 15 or 20 pounds. They're not expensive at all. But the most important thing is just follow the same principles. It's exactly the same. One real advantage to taking long exposure photography, and that is when you get people milling around. So we've got people moving around the pier at the moment because the tide hasn't come around it. Then on a long exposure image, as long as they're moving in the frame, they'll disappear. Now I'm managing to comfortably grab a 2-minute exposure with my 10-stop filter right smack bang in the middle of the day. And there's a very bright sun above my head. You can probably see by the light on my face, and yet I can still comfortably manage a 2-minute exposure. But that means if there was less light around me, i.e. if I was here early in the morning or maybe around about sunset time, then again going through exactly the same procedure, I could comfortably reach a 4 or possibly even an 8-minute exposure. Water is up and around the feet of the old pier, so I just need to give it maybe another 20 minutes or so for it to come this side of the old pier so that I can just see nothing but water and the old pier. I've got to tell you though, I certainly wouldn't recommend placing your tripod in wet sand like I'm currently doing, but once the tide has come all the way in, as long as the light doesn't change, and I very much doubt it will do, I shall just retreat and place my camera down on dry sand and go through exactly the same process. So this is my final image, a long exposure with a 10-stop filter that I created over 2 minutes. It's a shame that the clouds were a blanket grey, otherwise you would have noticed streaking in the skies that could potentially add interest in the image. Right, so that's the 10-stop workflow taken care of. It really is that simple. Remember, it's a science. So just remember that one number, which is 30. 30th of a second equates to 30 seconds, and then with your exposure triangle you play around to lengthen the shutter speed or shorten the shutter speed. It really is that simple. Now let's talk about a 15-stop filter. If you're a fan of coming out on a bright sunny day like today, taking long exposures, then the chances are you will be a fan of a 15-stop filter. Well, the good news is the process that we've just covered with regards to a 10-stop filter is exactly the same, except the starting number is different. So if you're a 15-stop filter fan, the number you need to remember is 250. That is it. Just remember 250. That means your starting number is 250th of a second, like we did with a 10-stop filter, whereby the starting figure was 30th of a second. Fans of 15-stop filters, it's just 250th of a second. So all you need to do, compose your shot, adjust your shutter speed so it reads 250th of a second, and then adjust your ISO and your aperture according to the light. And once you're happy with your exposure, you apply a 15-stop filter to the front of your lens, and that 250th of a second equates to 2 minutes. That's a 2-minute exposure taken care of straight away. And then, just like we did with a 10-stop filter, using your exposure triangle, adjust your ISO and your aperture depending on the length of shutter speed required. It really is that simple. hopefully you've enjoyed this tutorial, but more importantly, you'll put it into practice. So all that's left me to say is thank you very much indeed for watching. You can support the channel by giving that like button a bit of a nudge, and if you're new here and you want to find your way back, then consider subscribing as well. Until the next time, guys, cheers.